But we're now ready to resume, and we have both juries back in court, and the defense may call its next witness.
Thank you, Your Honor. The defense calls Dr. Ann Burgess.
Please raise your right hand. You do solemnly swear that the testimony you may give in the cause now pending before the court shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God. Please take the stand and state your name for the record.
Ann Wolbert Burgess,
Could you spell your full name, please?
ANNWOLBERT
And do you have a professional title?
Yes, I do.
And what is that?
I am a clinical specialist in psychiatric mental health nursing.
And you are you have a doctorate, do you not?
Yes, I
doctorate
do.
degree. And what is your doctor? You're a doctor of what?
I'm a doctor of nursing science.
So you're a doctor of nursing.
Yes.
And is your particular specialty psychiatric nursing?
Yes, it is.
And how long have you been, when did you receive your doctorate?
In 1966,
Now, what is your current profession?
I am a professor of psychiatric mental health nursing at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania.
And what are your other, if there are other, professional activities?
My other professional activities, I have a clinical practice
In what?
in both child and adult persons in psychotherapy.
Okay. And what licenses do you hold in order to be a psychotherapist?
I am certified as a clinical specialist in psychiatric mental health nursing, and that is by the American Nurses Association.
And do you have any state, do you need a state license for that?
Yes, I do.
And what states do you have licenses in?
I'm licensed in both Massachusetts and Pennsylvania.
And what state do you reside in?
I reside in Massachusetts.
And you teach in Pennsylvania?
Yes, I do.
Okay. Now, we were saying you have a clinical practice, and you're a professor, and you have a clinical practice as well. What other professional activities do you regularly engage in?
I also engage in research, clinical research,
In what fields are you engaged in clinical research?
in the fields of victim trauma, child sexual abuse, child pornography, crime scene analysis.
And are there any other professional activities that you have time for?
I also belong to professional organizations. I also hold positions with government agencies.
What agencies do you hold positions with?
I am chair for a study section at National Institutes of Health, the AIDS and Related Research Study Section 6.
Okay. Now, would you tell us about your educational background?
I have a Bachelor of Science degree from Boston University and my registered nurse at that time. I have a Master of Science degree from the University of Maryland, and I have a Doctor of Nursing Science from Boston University.
And after, did you complete your education all in one block and then start your professional work, or did you intersperse it?
I pretty much completed it in one block.
And would you tell us what the early years of your professional career were? What did you do and what were you involved with?
In my early, I always held an academic position, and I've always combined my academic position with a private practice. And because I'm an academe, I do research, and I write, I publish, and I attend professional conferences and serve on professional boards.
What was your first academic appointment?
My first academic appointment was at Boston College School of Nursing in Chestnut Hill, Massachusetts.
And what was your position there?
My position there was first associate professor, and then I was promoted to professor. And I also had some administrative positions. I was chair of the Community health program in nursing. And later, I was chair of the graduate program in nursing.
And what was your next academic position?
My next academic position was at Boston University, and I went there 1980 as director of nursing research.
Now, Boston University is a different institution than Boston College, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
One is BC and one is BU.
That's right.
Okay. And I'm sorry to interrupt you, but you were what at Boston University?
I was both director of nursing research, and then I was interim dean of the School of Nursing at Boston University.
And what was your next academic either distinction or position?
In 1983, I accepted a position at the University of Pennsylvania as the Van American Professor of Psychiatric Mental Health Nursing.
And you said currently you are the head of the Psychiatric Mental Health Nursing Division at the University of Pennsylvania School of Nursing?
Yes, I am chair of the division.
What do, and I take it in that you are educating, teaching people to become psychiatric nurses?
Yes, I'm responsible for that area of nursing.
Now, describe for the juries, if you would, what is it a psychiatric nurse does?
A psychiatric nurse diagnoses and treats actual and potential mental health problems, primarily is concerned with the care of persons who have mental problems, mental disorders.
Now, that's a different kind of track, isn't it, to get to be a therapist, for example, than just becoming a psychologist and doing it that way?
Yes, it is.
What is the main distinction in the training between being someone with a bachelor's degree in nursing and a specialty in psychiatric nursing versus someone who has a bachelor's degree in psychology and just graduate degrees in psychology?
Well, in nursing, we have our own body of knowledge, and at the undergraduate level, we prepare students to be what we call general practitioners so that they can practice in a general way in a variety of settings.
Nursing.
And that's all nursing. At the master's level is when we begin to specialize, and that is when a student would select a particular area. There are generally about 5 or 6 major areas in nursing. And then at the doctoral level is where the research is done, and it pretty much follows the fairly standard PhD, Doctor of Nursing Science program of studies. But the focus, of course, would be in nursing in our own field.
Now, someone with that kind of a background who obtains a doctorate in psychiatric nursing, do they have medical information, medical training that ordinary psychologists would not ordinarily have?
Yes, we have a strong biomedical background that our students must be able to master for a beginning level practice.
Now, you've indicated you've always held an academic position and you've always been involved in research. Is
Yes,
that correct?
I have.
Could you describe for the juries what your first focus of research was?
My first focus of research was when I was at Boston College, and this actually followed my joining with several other professors on campus to have an interdisciplinary seminar for our graduate students in the healthcare system. And at the close of that semester's seminar, a colleague from that seminar, a sociologist, Linda Holmstrom, approached me to talk about a research project that she wanted to undertake. And this was actually the first time that I began a course of research, and it was on the study of rape victims.
Now, what year was it that you started this research on rape victims?
It was a one-year study between 1972 and 1973.
Now, are you familiar, Dr. Burgess, with the term rape trauma syndrome?
Yes, I am.
And where did that term come from?
That was a term that Linda Holmstrom and I coined in one of our first major publications from our sample, and that was actually the title of a paper that was published in the American Journal of Psychiatry in 1974.
And has that concept, that syndrome that you and Linda Holmstrom defined, become accepted throughout both the law enforcement and psychological and psychiatric community?
Yes, it has been accepted by those communities.
Now, what Could you describe for us the areas of your research following this first project on rape victims?
The area of research then expanded from the adult victims to child and adolescent victims of sexual victimization.
And for how many years were you engaged in research dealing with sexual victimization of children?
This was about for the first 4 or 5 years. That was the primary area. It did expand into other areas, but that was the primary area.
And did you, as a consequence of your research and writing in this area, gain recognition as nationwide as an expert in child sexual abuse?
Yes, I did.
And as a result of that, were you contacted at some point by the Federal Bureau of Investigation?
Yes, I was.
And when were you contacted by the FBI?
I believe it was 1976, 77, about that time period, possibly even 75.
And what was the basis, what was the reason for the contact by the FBI? Why did they contact you?
Condition calls for speculation.
Overall.
At that particular time, the FBI Academy, that's based in Quantico, had the responsibility of training both their own agents, but also law enforcement. And they had received, I guess, a mandate that they needed to train in the area of rape and sexual assault.
Train in the area of rape and sexual assault in what sense? For what purpose?
In terms of the investigative aspect, because that's their specialty. But they needed information on the victim for them to be able to develop their training materials.
They needed information about victims of rape and sexual assault
Correct.
in order to be able to investigate those kinds of cases.
That's correct.
And were you at that time recognized as an expert in victimology?
At that time, yes. We were certainly publishing in the area. I'm not sure at that particular time because Linda Holmstrom and I were getting our publications out, and they do need a period of time in the journals to gain acceptance.
Are you now recognized as an expert in victimology?
Yes.
What is victimology?
Victimology is a study of the victim in which all aspects, as best research is able to do, brings to bear on that particular topic.
For what purpose? Why do you want to know about victims?
The victims tell an important or a very key part of any investigation. If you're doing it from the investigative standpoint, and certainly from a clinical standpoint, they need treatment. But from an investigation, that is your primary source very often of information. And so that is one of their first starting points in law enforcement.
And what is it that victimology, that the study of victims is attempting to do for law enforcement? What is the kind of information you're trying to give law enforcement about victims that can aid law enforcement in their investigation of these kinds of crimes?
Well, the task of law enforcement is to find a suspect. It's suspect apprehension is what law enforcement is primarily engaged in. And once that phase is completed, then that generally starts the criminal justice system process.
Okay. But what is it about victimology that does it assist in suspect apprehension? Does it also assist in presenting the case and knowing how to deal with victims and knowing how to assess their information, that kind of thing?
Yes. And what the training is how to interview, how to take information, how to get the very best that you can from a victim. And of course, that is what we would try to help them with. They need to understand the state that the victim is in at the time they see the victim and know how to perhaps reduce some stress to get information from the victim.
Is there also, based on your research and others in the field, are there also guidelines for interviewing victims in these kinds of cases so that you're not suggesting things to them, so that you're getting as accurate and credible information as you can?
Absolutely. Yes.
Are there also, based on your research and others' research, indicia that you're training law enforcement in of when people who claim to be victims of these crimes are indeed likely to be telling the truth versus perhaps not?
Yes, all of those things, yes.
And are all of those things that you have studied and researched and are considered an expert in?
Yes.
Okay, so after this contact by the FBI, did you begin an affiliation with the Federal Bureau of Investigation?
Yes, the training division at the academy in Quantico.
And what was it that you were doing for them?
Well, one of the things, it was a joint venture actually in terms of helping them with what is called the data reduction. They were doing interviews with criminals that they would be interviewing and trying to amass a certain amount of information. And that's precisely what I and some colleagues began to assist them in. And so that was really the research part and consultation.
Okay, so you were interviewing what's also known as perpetrators, is that correct?
The agents were interviewing them. We were assisting them with the data analysis part.
Okay, just to break that down. Agents are interviewing perpetrators of sex crimes?
Some were sex crimes, of sex crimes, yes,
Okay.
at the time.
I mean, with regard to your involvement, and at that time, was it, and you were trying to assess the data that the agents were receiving from the perpetrators?
Well, essentially, we devised a protocol that the agents then did two parts of an interview. They would do their regular interview, and then they would complete the protocol based on not only the interview, but they are very thorough in their work, and they do not just, they would look at all kinds of records to corroborate kinds of things. And so that's what we helped them with to the protocol.
What was the purpose of the protocol? What was the type of information that was being sought from the perpetrators?
Well, we were looking for patterns and hopefully for some predictors that would then assist law enforcement in their suspect apprehension. That's always the goal, if you will, of law enforcement.
So you were trying to find similar patterns among perpetrators of these kinds of crimes to assist law enforcement in apprehending other perpetrators?
Yes.
Other crimes?
Yes. Well, they would take the sample that we had, and then you would look at that from a statistical standpoint to see if that had application to other crimes.
And did there appear to be patterns of behavior, patterns of perhaps even psychological makeup among sex crime offenders?
Objection, Your Honor.
Overruled. You can answer that question.
Yes, that is essentially true, yes.
Now, was this the only assistance you provided to the FBI with respect to developing protocols and patterns for apprehending suspects, or were there some other areas you got involved in with them as well?
Oh, yes, we got involved with, over the past 15 years, we've been involved in a number of studies, and some of which have been funded by the Department of Justice that have looked at other things.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the
That
last.
have looked at other aspects
Other aspects of what?
of investigative work.
Okay. So you're still involved with the FBI, is that correct?
Yes, I am.
Now, for the past 10 years, have you been involved in a particular set of studies or projects with the FBI?
Yes, I have.
And what is that study called, or what is it about?
The overall study is called the Crime Classification Project, of which there are a number of parts to that.
Okay, what part have you been affiliated with?
The part that originally started was what was called the crime scene analysis. And that is part of what's called the profiling process, which is
Okay, a profiling process of whom?
profiling process of a unnamed subject.
The FBI was trying to develop profiles in order to help them apprehend unknown suspects.
Profile indicators, right? Not profiles in terms of any identified person, but just characteristics, if you will, of unknown subjects.
And one of the ways they were trying to develop that was by analyzing crime scenes.
That is correct.
And what was your involvement in the crime scene analysis portion of the crime classification project?
My role was in the analysis of the information that they brought from the interviews that they had with the convicted offenders.
But that's, all right, but what involvement did you have in the process of examining crime scenes in order to make determinations about potential perpetrators?
Okay. Well, one of the things was to actually look at how they examine crime scenes, the types of records, photographs, information, forensics, the massive amount of information that they took, and then how they looked at that and essentially how they thought their process of thinking in coming to an investigative decision, if you will, about the material that they had seen.
And were you involved with the FBI agents in refining and defining the methods by which, or the ways in which they would classify crime scenes in order to work out these characteristics of potential offenders?
Yes, I was.
And was one of the areas in which the FBI was classifying crime scenes the area of homicides where people are killed?
That is, yes, it was.
And how long has this particular project been going on?
That project began in 1980 with a funded study.
And were you were involved with it then, is that correct?
I was principal investigator on that project.
And over the course of work on that project, did the FBI and those of you who were consulting with this project come up with classifications of homicides by crime scene?
Yes.
And how many different classifications of homicides by crime scene are there?
Basically three.
Excuse me, three?
Three.
And what are the three classifications?
One is the organized, one is the disorganized, and there is a third category that has been added that's called a mixed crime scene.
Now, are there 32 kinds of homicide according to the FBI guidelines?
This is one, yes. The most recent classification of homicide identifies, I think it's 32 categories within the homicide section.
Okay. And is there a category for what's known as domestic homicide?
Yes, there is.
And what does domestic homicide mean?
Domestic homicide means where there is some type of relationship between the victim and the offender. Generally must be either a significant partner or a family member.
And are there guidelines for, well, strike that. In analyzing a crime scene, are there indicia or indicators, things that under this method of crime scene analysis point to domestic homicide versus some other kind?
Yes, there are.
And I take it there are things that point to non-domestic homicide as well.
Yes.
Okay. Now, in this particular case, Dr. Burgess, were you asked to, in effect, apply these guidelines from this FBI crime classification methodology to the crime scene in this case?
Yes, I was.
And what information or objects were you asked to review in order to make that kind of analysis?
The information included all of the crime scene photographs, the forensic reports, the medical examiner's reports, the police reports, anything that pertained to information relating to the crime scene.
Did you also read the testimony of the coroner, medical examiner in this trial?
Yes, I did.
Did you read the testimony of the investigating officer, Detective Zoller?
Yes, I did.
And you said you looked at all the crime scene photographs?
Yes, I did.
Did you also look at the autopsy photographs?
Yes, I did.
And based on your review of that material, were you able to make some classifications of this crime scene?
Yes, I did.
First of all, with respect to type of homicide, were there indicators here that pointed to a particular type of the 32 types under the FBI classification system?
Yes.
And what particular type of homicide did the crime scene analysis indicate?
A domestic killing.
And why did the analysis of the crime scene indicate a domestic killing?
There was no forced entry. There was no movement. The bodies were not touched. They were left as what is called the death scene was the same as the crime scene. They were not moved. There was no evidence of material being taken
You mean no
from the
theft?
house. No theft, right, no theft. Not even the doors to the house, there was no break-in there, and there appeared to be no break-in through gates.
So that tends to indicate what?
That tends to indicate that there is a known relationship, that these were not strangers.
Well, does it tend to show that it's a family member or a close relationship, or could it also show an acquaintance or a?
Well, initially you would look at all of those factors, but essentially that there was no break-in, and the bodies were essentially certainly suggested that it was domestic rather than they had expected, had let somebody in.
Well, if they had let somebody in, they certainly weren't shot right upon that point. Is that
That is
what you're
correct.
saying? That
That is
they're in an interior room of the house?
Yes, they were.
Now, in addition to making a determination in crime scene analysis of the type of homicide, I believe you started to tell us before that there are three basic classifications for the crime scene itself.
That is correct.
And you said they were, number one was disorganized,
That is correct.
and number two was organized,
That is correct.
and number three was mixed.
Right. They
Now-
should be the other way. It should be mixed, should be in the middle.
Okay, disorganized, mixed,
Mixed.
and organized. I'll do it that way. Okay, now, what is the purpose, if you will, of classifying a crime scene as either organized or disorganized?
It speaks to the amount of planning that can be determined from just looking at the crime scene.
And why would the FBI or any law enforcement agency, for example, what investigative purpose does it serve to analyze a crime scene to see if there has been planning or no planning?
Well, it's generally going to alert or tell the investigating officer where to focus their investigation, what type of person, what relationship, et cetera, to begin to look for.
And are there certain crime scenes that tell a great deal about the actual person, if not the actual identity, personality characteristics of the perpetrator?
Yes, in fact, that's essentially what the FBI describe it as, is that they try to read the personality, if you will, of what has happened in the crime scene.
Was the earliest part of this study focusing on serial sexual killings?
Yes, it was.
And was it characteristic of many of those killings that there were sort of repetitive, since they were serial killings, there's more than one, but I mean sort of ritualistic features?
Yes, there was.
So with respect to those kinds of crime scenes, can a great deal be learned from the psychology, if you will, of the perpetrator?
Oh, yes. And don't forget, the other part of the study was they had done the interviews with these persons.
With people who had been convicted of such.
Yes, and they talked about their crime. So it wasn't just the crime scene, but it was able to get the offenders did talk at length.
And so as a result of this study, did the FBI develop a way of looking at a crime scene to know when certain kinds of planning is going on as reflected by what they wind up with?
Yes.
Now, with respect to a disorganized crime scene, what does that say? How does that fit into the notion of planning or no planning?
Disorganization generally implies low amount of planning,
If any?
if any. Correct.
And I take it an organized crime scene
Shows very few clues, very elaborate planning, certainly to the point where there's no apprehension of a suspect.
And when you talk about planning, is it viewed from a perspective of just whether you could tell how much thinking went in, Or is it viewed from the perspective of, if you will, detection?
It is from detection as a major part.
Now, would you explain just what that means? I mean,
How to, the detection aspect of a suspect, this is what was looked at in terms of the study of how quickly the person was apprehended. More likely than not on the disorganized side that the suspect was almost immediately apprehended. And see, that's the way the statistics came in, this is by placing these into the crime scene patterns, and then to see how fast there was suspect apprehension.
so but my question is, does the planning component have to do with planning to avoid detection?
Oh, yes. That's the intent of the offender, to avoid detection, yes.
Okay, I mean, that's the kind of planning that they're looking at.
Yes,
It's not like planning to, inflict a particular injury or planning to leave a pink scarf under a radiator. It's planning to avoid detection that they're focused on. Is that right?
yes.
So if you find a disorganized crime scene, then what you're finding is low or no amount of planning to avoid detection. Would that be a fair statement?
Generally, yes. Mhm.
And in applying these guidelines and analytical methods to the crime scene here, did you reach a conclusion about what kind of crime scene this was?
Yes, I did.
And what was that?
And I will preface it that there are generally there may be indicators of both organized and disorganized, but generally in this crime scene, I saw more evidence of disorganization.
And did that indicate to you a lack of planning to avoid detection?
Yes.
Objection, improper.
Objection sustained. The answer is struck.
Does it appear to be a disorganized crime scene because you cannot see any any significant evidence of planning to avoid detection?
Yes.
Now, what was, under the FBI's criteria, what was disorganized about this crime scene?
Okay. Location, choice of
Why don't you
weapon.
give me a list and
Oh.
I'll ask you to do it.
Okay.
Location.
Location, choice of weapon,
Mm-hmm.
injuries to victims,
Mm-hmm.
emotionality, indicators of emotionality, where the actual injuries were.
Okay. Is there also a concept that's applied in crime scene analysis called staging or lack of staging?
Yes, there is.
Is that part of the analysis of whether it's a disorganized crime scene, or is that another type of indicator?
No, it is an indicator that is also considered staging, yes.
And did you find staging or lack of staging in your analysis of this crime scene?
Lack of staging,
And is that an indicator of disorganized crime scene?
yes, it is.
Okay, so we've got 6 factors now. Are there any others that you determined pointing to a disorganized crime scene?
No, no.
Now, was there a factor pointing towards organized that showed some pre-thought?
Yes.
And what was the organized factor?
One organized factor was that there were no shells found
Okay,
at the crime scene.
and was there any other organized factor that you could tell just by looking at the crime
No,
scene?
that was the main factor.
Okay, now let's talk about each of these factors of disorganization, starting with location. What is it about the location that points to disorganized or no significant evidence of planning to avoid detection?
There was one other factor on the organized, the lack of weapon, I'm sorry. Lack of weapon and no shells.
Okay, so lack of weapons left at the scene
At the
is what
scene.
you mean.
Yes.
Okay, and we'll get to those as well. Let's start just with what is it about the location? What do you mean by location?
Okay, location is where actually the crime occurred.
And what is the location here?
Location here is interior of a home that's in a residential area, in a fairly residential area. In other words, there are other houses around, and it is inside.
Okay, and what appears to be lacking in plan for escaping detection about that site?
Well, one of the factors you have to also add the type of weapon that was used.
Okay.
I'd like to combine that to look at those two. The type of weapon it was known was a shotgun.
Now, you're familiar, are you not, based on your work with the FBI and how shotguns operate?
Yes,
You're familiar with other weapons as well, based on that work?
yes, I am.
In fact, have you been to crime scenes and actually done this analysis on site?
Yes, I have.
All right. So then we have a combination then of shotguns in a residential area being used in an interior room.
Yes.
Okay. And maybe it's obvious, but what is it about that bespeaks no significant evidence of planning to avoid detection?
Okay. Well, one of the factors is that this is a very loud type of weapon to be used, and the number of shells that were fired, there was a large number of shells fired, and so that the noise certainly was a key factor.
And when you do your crime scene analysis, the initial analysis has to do solely with what the actual scene is like. Is that right?
That's right.
But does the FBI, and do you in working with them, upgrade the analysis as more and more information comes in?
Yes, you do.
And are you aware, therefore, that in this case, both in in-court testimony and police interviews, a fairly large number of neighbors heard this?
Yes, I am aware of that.
And does that validate the initial analysis that using a shotgun in a residential neighborhood in an interior of a house is going to be heard?
Yes.
Okay, now you didn't know anything, by the way, and you haven't been given any information, have you, about the average response time of the Beverly Hills Police Department to gunshots in their little city?
No, I don't have that information.
Did you have the information that the Beverly Hills Police Department is located less than a mile from this particular crime scene?
No, I did not know that.
Okay, now you said the third factor here pointing towards or leading to the characterization as disorganized was the injuries to the victims. And what do you mean by that?
Injuries to victim is that you look at where on the body in a gun shooting case where the injuries are, and not only where they are on the body, but the number.
And why does that tell you something about organization versus, or how does that tell you something about organization versus disorganization?
Okay, the more organized type of person who shoots is going to use the minimum amount of shots to accomplish the task.
And why is that? Why is using a minimum amount, if you're more organized, preferable?
Because several reasons. One, they've thought about it, they've planned it out, they want to do it as fast as they can, if you will, and avoid detection, so to get out of the area fast.
Okay. And you said there was another?
It's the type, also the type of weapon that's chosen to accomplish the task.
Okay, when you talk about that a more organized, a more planned shooting would use fewer shot, you put that in terms of getting out as fast as can. Is noise obviously also a factor?
Oh yes, noise is a factor, and the location, that the site, if you will, of the shot to again accomplish the task.
So
Side of the body.
In your analysis here, based on the photographs and the autopsy report and the testimony, did you determine that this was an unnecessarily large number of shots?
Protection and proper injury.
Sustained.
Okay. Did you determine that the number of shots here bespoke a disorganized crime scene?
Yes.
And you said that there was also an aspect of disorganization based on evidence of emotionality in this crime scene. And could you tell us what that means?
Yes. that the term is sometimes used overkill, that there is more shots are fired than is necessary to accomplish the task. And this was the situation in this crime scene, that a large number, far more shots were fired than necessary.
So and that indicates that there is emotion involved?
Yes, that generally points to what's called a high degree of emotion.
Now, are there any indications based on any of the crime scene information as to what emotion might have been involved?
Sexual cause for speculation.
Your Honor, that's just a foundational question.
Well, we haven't laid a foundation for any such opinion.
All right. In the analysis in these guidelines for analysis that have been developed by the FBI, are there criteria concerning where the wounds are inflicted on victims that, based on all of the research, indicate particular attitudes by the perpetrator towards the victim?
Yes.
And you indicated that one of the indicators here of disorganization was where the injuries were.
Yes.
Is that tied to the emotionality issue?
Yes.
Okay. And what is the research shown that the FBI has conducted about the location of injuries and the attitude or emotional state, if you will, of the perpetrator?
Yes. Well, the research looks at, for example, if one site, one particular area is focused on, that indicates a lot of, it could be anger or rage, for example, in sexual homicide. Parts of the body are focused upon that speak to the emotion the person has towards the sexual parts.
Okay, so in one of the analysis, if it appears that a particular part of the body has been singled out, such as the sexual parts of the body in sexual crimes, that bespeaks anger towards the victim?
It speaks about their focus on those particular parts. In other areas, oftentimes face, there is an enormous amount of injury to the face. It doesn't have to be a gunshot, but it can be other beating and so forth. So that the site of the injury, whether it be by hand or by gun, is important. It's called either depersonalization, as a way to read the injury part of the victim.
Okay. Now, when you said to the face, you're talking about where most of the trauma is focused on one part.
Yes.
Okay. Now, in this particular case, what analysis did you come up with concerning where the injuries were on these two decedents?
My analysis that the injuries were random, if you will. They were to all parts of the body. There was not one area singled out.
Did you determine that there were even injuries to parts of the body that would not be debilitating? I mean, to parts of the body that made no difference with respect to either bringing about a fatal response or debilitating the victim?
Protection vein.
What conclusion, based on this analysis, could be drawn, or what could be posited, if you will, about the fact that the injuries here appeared to be random and were to all parts of the body?
Well, that would speak to a more pervasive emotion than just one emotion, such as anger or rage or what, but would speak to a wider aspect,
Such
as fear.
Now, you said that there was a concept called staging,
Yes, I did.
and you indicated you found lack of staging here. Now, what is it that you saw or learned about this crime scene that led you to that conclusion? First of all, why don't you explain for us what staging means?
Staging means that the offender has done something to the crime scene to make it look like another crime occurred, or in some way to cover up or to lead investigators into another direction.
Okay. Now, is that like affirmatively putting things or doing things to make it look like somebody unlike the offender did the crime?
Yes, things can be actually added and brought in, or things can be removed, such as in removing items, burglarizing, to make it look like that was the primary intent.
Okay. Now, you said, though, that there were no shells found here. So something, and obviously you know about shotguns, these things fly out of them and they do hit the ground, right?
Yes.
So is the removal of the shells here staging, or is that something else?
No, that wouldn't necessarily be called staging, because it is removing, it's related to the weapon and removing the weapon, but not in the sense that it's trying to make it look like another type of crime. It's quite clear what the crime was, or the killings were.
Well, it also doesn't indicate any, strike that. You indicated one example of staging would be, for example, to make it look like the place was burglarized when in fact it was a domestic crime.
That's correct.
Or to move the bodies to make it look like there was some maybe potential for ransom or something like that when it was just a domestic crime.
That's correct.
So you didn't see any evidence of that staging.
No, I did not.
Now, you aware of the fact, based on testimony and police reports, that there actually were 2 rifles in the house at the time of the shooting?
Yes, I'm aware of that.
Would it be considered staging if, for example, those rifles had been loaded by the shooters and placed in that family room?
That would be one indicator, or suggest one indicator, yes.
Let's take our recess until 1:30, ladies and gentlemen. We'll resume at 1:30. Please don't.
And what does that bespeak concerning any of these indicators of disorganization?
In terms of targeting or focusing in on a particular site, it shows that there was much more of a random aspect to the shooting. It was not clearly planned into one area.
Okay. Now, in analyzing a crime scene for planning purposes, do you look at it with a view to different stages, planning stages?
Yes.
And what are the different planning stages?
There are 3 planning stages. One is where you try to get what's called the pre-crime, before the crime.
Pre-crime planning?
Planning, pre-crime planning.
Okay.
Second would be during the crime.
Okay. Now, if you talk about planning during the crime, that means taking additional action, planning additional action?
Yes, actually how it is enacted, how the crime is enacted.
Okay, so during the crime, how it's enacted bespeaks planning at that level or planning before the crime even began?
It may include both, but primarily what happens during that precise time.
Okay, and what's the third stage?
And then the third is the immediate post-crime behavior for planning.
All right, now you have testified that there were 2 indicators of planning at some point, in the fact that no shells were found, which means somebody took the time to pick them up, and the weapons were not left behind, meaning they were removed from the scene.
That's true.
Now, do those 2 facts, shells being picked up and weapons removed, do those speak to pre-crime planning, during crime planning, or post-crime planning?
I speak to post-crime planning.
Now, there is evidence in this case that is not evidence from the crime scene concerning reloading, okay?
Yes.
It's not your role here to comment on all the evidence in this case and decide whether this was or was not a planned crime, is it?
That's true.
You're here to analyze a crime scene?
Yes.
Okay. I want to ask you one hypothetical question, though, based on the number of injuries inflicted and the location of the injuries and the significance of those injuries from a mortality standpoint, as testified to by the coroner, okay?
Yes.
And I want to give you this hypothetical question. If hypothetically there is one reloaded shot and it is to the left side of Mrs. Menendez's face, okay?
Yes.
In your opinion, was that more evidence of overkill?
Yes, it was.
Was that shot, based on your medical background and you're reading the testimony here, necessary in any way to affect the death of that of Mrs. Menendez.
No, it was not necessary.
You're familiar with the coroner's testimony that she had received numerous other fatal wounds.
That is correct.
Now, is there another way of characterizing a crime scene apart from disorganized and organized? Is there a way of characterizing it in terms of risk of detection?
Yes.
And did you make that analysis with respect to this crime scene?
Yes, I did.
And how would you characterize this crime scene with respect to risk of detection?
Characterize it as high risk of detection.
Now, you've indicated, all right, why don't you tell us what the factors are that lead you to characterize this as high risk of detection? I take it to the person who did the shooting.
Okay. Well, one of the indicators of detection would be getting evidence on one's person. And given the location, type of weapon, there is a high probability that some of the blood from the close range firing of multiple shots would have in some way gotten on to the person or persons. The second is, of course, the location, the small area in which this crime occurred, and the noise from the multiple guns, and that it was in August at a time when doors would be open in terms of the noise being heard outside of that immediate area.
Now, in another respect, let's assume now you can't tell when you analyze a crime scene, I take it, strike that. In looking at this crime scene when you analyze this crime scene, you put out of your head anything you knew about who was ultimately arrested and what the rest of the facts of the case were. Is that
Yes.
correct? And could you tell just by a pure analysis of the physical evidence of the crime scene whether there was one shooter or two shooters?
No.
Now, later on, of course, you know that both Eric and Lyle were arrested, and now you know, of course, that both Eric and Lyle have testified that they were the shooters in this crime scene.
Yes.
From the perspective then of two people shooting in this close space with shotguns, was there an additional element of risk, not of detection, but of another kind of risk in this crime scene?
In terms of, yes, in terms of, first of all, reloading was one issue, and the second of getting the evidence on them.
I'm talking about risk in a small space with two people shooting shotguns off.
Well, the noise certainly is going to be double the noise in terms of, and at fast, rapid, if you will, shooting, that the
How
noise
about
would be
the-
very loud.
How about the risk of shooting each other?
Oh, absolutely, knowing that they're absolutely.
So does the fact that two people would be involved in shooting a large number of rounds from shotguns, loaded mainly with size 4 buckshot in a relatively small space, bespeak careful, thoughtful planning?
No, it does not.
Now, in addition to the risk of evidence such as blood or from the actual shooting, are you familiar with, you've indicated you're familiar with shotguns, you're familiar with the forensic evidence that guns produce, are you not?
Yes, I am.
You're familiar with gunshot residue testing, for example.
Yes, I am.
And firing a large number of rounds from a shotgun, does that produce a fairly large quantity of gunshot residue?
Yes, it does.
So if there is evidence that persons fired this kind of gun and there's no evidence that they wore anything protective to keep the residue off them, does that add to the high-risk nature of this crime scene?
Yes.
Now, in picking up the shells, okay, in analyzing this crime scene, when you looked at it and realized that the shooter had or shooters had picked up the shells, although that bespeaks some post-crime planning, does it increase risk of detection post-crime?
Yes, it does.
And in what way?
Because the evidence can be found It depends where the evidence goes, where it is ultimately put.
So there is a transportation period or a need then to try to dispose of something.
That's correct.
And if it's the person who did the shooting who's trying to do that, that person's running around with evidence.
That's correct.
Now, in these studies of particularly serial killers, people who have killed multiple times, where you see, I guess, the highest level of organization and planning,
That's correct, yes.
when people like that are planning crimes, do they plan for these eventualities, like you'll have to get rid of this and you'll have to get rid of that unless you do it this way or unless you do it that way?
Yes.
That's irrelevant.
Overall.
Yes, they do.
So is the fact that you then take evidence and leave it in a place and call the police and bring them to that place a non-planned, non-thought-out type of activity?
Yes, it is.
Now, you're aware in this case, are you not, that it was Eric and Lyle who called the police, the defendants who called the police to the scene?
I'm aware of that.
And you're aware, are you not, that prior to ever searching Eric Menendez's car, the police allowed Eric and Lyle Menendez to go to that car and they removed material from it?
I'm aware of that.
Does the need to do that bespeak pre-crime planning?
No, it does not.
Is there, strike that, with disorganized crime scenes,
Yes.
is there a pattern to the apprehension of the perpetrators?
Yes, there is.
And what is that pattern?
Objection, irrelevant.
Sustained.
With highly disorganized crime scenes and in domestic type crimes, okay?
Yes.
Does the FBI train both their own agents and other law enforcement to look for the perpetrator right there at the scene?
Objection, irrelevant.
Sustained.
In this case, were the shooters right there at the scene when the police came?
Yes, they were.
Are disorganized crime scene creators ordinarily caught more quickly than organized crime scene creators?
Objection, irrelevant.
Sustained.
Isn't the whole point of this crime scene analysis to assist the police in the swift apprehension of perpetrators?
Yes, it is.
And isn't it also standard investigative practice and taught as part of this crime scene classification that the person who calls in at a scene of a domestic crime is usually the prime suspect?
Objection, irrelevant.
Sustained.
Now, you're aware, are you not, Dr. Burgess, that there's evidence in this case that Eric and Lyle Menendez purchased the weapons used some days before the shooting?
Yes, I'm aware of that.
Now, is that activity any part of crime scene analysis or crime scene classification?
It may be, yes.
Does the fact that the weapons used in a disorganized crime scene were purchased days before change the analysis that the crime scene was still disorganized with respect to planning to avoid detection?
Objection, vague.
Rephrase the question.
Okay. Your opinion is that in applying these FBI guidelines of analysis, that this crime scene bespeaks lack of pre-crime planning?
That is correct.
All right. Does the fact that the shotguns that were used were bought 3 days before change that?
No, it does not.
Okay, now I'm going to change the subject, if I might. After this 15-year project with the FBI, did you engage in other research?
Yes, I did.
Actually, during the same 15 years, you were doing other things as well, were you not?
Yes, I was.
And were you involved in a clinical practice as well as your teaching?
Yes, I was.
And did you, during those same years, publish articles and other writings concerning abused children, sexually molested children, victims of sexual assault?
Yes, I did.
And did that research and the clinical practice, in your clinical practice, you treat sexually abused persons, do you not?
Yes, I do.
Did that lead you to another area of research apart from this crime scene analysis and victimology?
Yes, it did.
And what area of research did that work lead you to?
The area of research led to the understanding of the brain and its functioning. And this came about because in our clinical work, my colleague, Carol Hartman, and I noticed how persistent symptoms were that victims had. And despite our efforts to try to extinguish some of those symptoms, we were not having a great deal of success. And so we looked for information that could help us to better understand it. If we could better understand it, that would give us some ideas of where to point our directions for treatment.
Okay, let me interrupt you for a minute so we can get some definition here of some terms you've used. You said in treating your patients in your clinical practice, these were victims of?
Yes, of crime victims or trauma victims.
Okay. When you talk about trauma victims, do sexually molested children and other abused children fit within that category of trauma victims?
Yes, they do.
Do Vietnam War veterans fit within that category of trauma victims?
Yes, they do.
Do children who have observed wars or violence in the home fit within that category of trauma victims?
Yes, they do.
Are people who are involved, not just victims of crime, but victims of accidents where they're badly hurt, can they be trauma victims?
Yes, they may be.
All right. And does your practice include people from all those categories of trauma victims?
Yes, they do.
Now, you said there were persistent symptoms. Were these symptoms related to the trauma?
Yes, they were.
And you said you couldn't reach them in therapy. What do you mean by that? What do you mean you couldn't reach these symptoms in therapy?
Using traditional therapy, which is talking therapy, psychotherapy.
You couldn't get rid of the symptoms? Is that what you mean?
Yes, I mean, we could do a lot of talking, but the intrusive thoughts and the images were still very present in the victims, the patients.
That was my next question. What were the symptoms that were proving so resistant to therapy?
The recurring thoughts of what had happened, and it would be both the visual images that they had, it would be wherever from a sensory standpoint, they might see things, they might hear things, they may smell things, they would get a re-experiencing of the traumatic event.
And is this an area that's been subject to a fair amount of research, the fact that traumatized people tend to re-experience aspects of the trauma?
Yes.
Is this something that in fact began as research into what used to be called shell shock and the experience of soldiers in war?
Yes, it is.
All right, so you wanted to get more information to understand why you couldn't help these patients stop having these replays, if you will, of the trauma.
Yes.
And where did you look to get that information?
We began reviewing the information that was available in the latest brain research, the way the mind worked, if you will, the cognitive sciences, the brain research, stress response theory, and information processing theory.
Was there some basic fund of knowledge about why trauma was producing this replay effect?
Yes, there was some basic information on that.
Could you give us some of that information as, I mean, not dumbed down, but simple enough that we can get it without having to spend 3 or 4 hours listening to it, okay?
Okay.
Okay,
Yes.
if you could.
Okay. Basically, it is we identified the area where much of this processing problem occurred.
What do you mean by processing problem?
Okay, information comes into a person's mind via neurons that are housed in the brain. They're, if you will, like little neural mappings that we have in our brains, and there are neurotransmitters that carry information from one point to another. And this is basically what comprises how people think and organize their thinking.
Okay, so information comes in and it follows some kind of little map for that kind of information?
That's right. There are various areas in the brain, if you will, that get stimulated depending on what kind of information is coming in.
Okay.
And the area that houses, if you will, the most important part of the brain for all of this is what's called the limbic system. And this limbic system is a group of brain regions. There are actually 3 very important parts of this limbic system. I can say what they are if you want.
Well, I'm going to give you the diagram in a few minutes.
Okay.
May I approach, please?
All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to have a little bit of further discussion, the lawyers and I and the witness. So we'll give you a break here until 2:30. Don't discuss the matter among yourselves or with anyone else, and we'll resume at 2:30.
Just because she doesn't know biology doesn't mean we have
All
to
right,
teach it
let's
to her.
not bicker here. There is an objection as to the foundation and as to the nature of the research and whether or not the research itself is accepted as reliable information in the medical community, and the results of that research and the specific conclusions that have been drawn from that are the issues here.
Well, Your Honor, with all due respect, I don't believe the people are entitled to a complete run-through of this witness's testimony. And our understanding is Kelly Fry, even if it were still the law, and I don't believe it still is, does not apply to basic medical research, which
Well,
has
People versus Kelly is the law in the state of California, and that's, as far as I know, the rule, and Mr. Burt wants to pop up and say something otherwise here.
well,
But with all due respect, you're going to have to lay a foundation.
okay. Dr. Burgess, do you teach the
Could I be
functioning?
heard on that point?
Yeah.
Just because it may focus whatever it is the objection
Sure.
is here. The court made reference to the McDonald case at sidebar,
Yes.
and
I analogized what the offer of proof is to some extent to the type of evidence introduced in People versus McDonald, or that was not introduced in People versus McDonald, that the Supreme Court said should have been.
yes, and this is a quote from People versus McDonald, where the court says, "We have never applied the Kelly Fry rule to expert medical testimony, even when the witness is a psychiatrist and the subject matter is as esoteric as a reconstruction of a past state of mind or the prediction of future dangerousness, or even the diagnosis of an unusual form of mental illness not listed in the diagnostic manual of the American Psychiatric Association." And then following up on McDonald is People versus Stoll, Stoll, which we cited to the court in another context.
Yes.
And that also indicates that medical testimony, expert opinion testimony, along the lines of psychological testimony or medical testimony, is not subject to a Kelly Fry objection. So that's why I raised with the prosecution what the basis for the objection is. If it's qualification, that seems to be one thing, but I don't think it's subject to a Kelly Fry objection.
Well, Kelly Fry is a standard, whether it's that standard or some other lesser standard that is applied. Still, there should be a foundation laid before such evidence is introduced. If there is an objection made in a timely fashion to it, the court has a discretion to conduct these hearings outside the presence of the jury and has elected to do so. We've done that with various witnesses that the prosecution has called, and we're doing it with this one. People did not object to any of these other matters that have been gone into so far by this witness, but they are objecting to this. And it is, as far as this court is concerned, a novel area of evidence, and one that the court feels is subject to a foundation. Whether you label it one way or another, or what standard I use to evaluate it is not the point at this time, but the foundation should be established.
I'd like to sit down because I'm freezing. And it's warmer if you sit down. I've learned in this courtroom. Let's
Okay, it's a new physical phenomenon. Hot air does not rise. Okay. That is
It
not
wouldn't
something
matter if
Kelly
it,
Fry test.
it wouldn't matter if it did because I'm too short to ever get to the hot air you're on.
Well, that's why it's so warm up here. All right, you may proceed.
You're too kind, too often.
You're,
Dr. Burgess, do you teach the operation of the limbic system at University of Pennsylvania?
Yes, I do.
And how many? We will mark them in a minute. How long have you been teaching this particular area of medical and biological research?
Since 1986.
And how well researched is the operation of the human limbic system?
It came into the literature with Walter Buchanan back in 1929 when he described the fight-flight phenomenon.
And is the limbic system as the source of the human brain's response to fear, is that an area that has been researched for some 60 odd years?
Yes.
And is it included in medical textbooks, medical journals? Is it taught even in high schools as basic biological science?
Yes, it is.
And was the basic research in this area, does it still continue, the basic animal research in the functioning of the brain?
Yes, it does.
Now, is it possible to do basic research on human beings when it comes to brain function?
No, it is not.
So is all the research that has been conducted, basic research in the actual workings of the brain, been conducted on animals over all these years?
Primarily with animals, but I should say that there is beginning research, especially on people that have organic brain issues like Alzheimer's and so forth, to begin to apply and study. It's not necessarily going into the brain, but it certainly is trying to see the origin, if you will, of the problem so that we can do something about it.
Well, medical technology has advanced to the point in the last, say, 15 years where certain brain functions can actually be observed without having to cut somebody's head open and cut out the brain.
That's
correct?
right.
So to the extent that medical technology allows access to the brain, some of this basic research is now being done on real humans.
That's correct, yes.
But prior to that, when the fundamental research in limbic system as the source of the so-called fight, flight, or fear response had to be conducted on animals because you couldn't cut up people's heads.
That's correct, yes.
Okay. Now, in your research, first of all, the research that you have been doing has to do with seeing how the limbic system functions with respect to people who have been traumatized by fear.
That is correct.
And trying to understand how the traumatization by fear impacts the limbic system.
That is correct.
And also trying to see how such people who have been traumatized by fear react to fear, if you will, in a biological sense. What happens to their brains?
That's correct.
And this research is being conducted by how many different groups that you're aware of?
There are many groups that are conducting this. Want me to list them?
Well, the ones that, besides your own research in this, there are others.
Right. Bessel van der Kolk has done research. Bruce Perry has done research. A lot of the VA, Veterans Administration hospitals, are now funded to do research on their veterans.
The group of veterans who have been traumatized?
Yes, that's correct.
And basically, what is the findings of this research concerning the limbic system in traumatized people?
Well, the finding is that at least there is that area, that it is there, and probably the more...
What is there?
That's where the fear response is. When that gets activated, what they are now looking at is what's called the recoding, the genetic recoding that develops into the explains why the ability of the person to have this flashback, to have this thought come back into their mind with what appears to be no stimulation. In other words, they're not back in a traumatizing situation, but they're still getting the re-experiencing of the flashback.
So they're beginning to understand by studying the brain that there has been some genetic recoding of the neural structure of this set of regions of the brain.
Yeah, because there is always cellular death. And so with the new cells that are part of the way our bodies operate, there is that new genetic recoding, and it recodes for a higher level of fear, is what the current research suggests.
Now, the research that's been done that actually shows regeneration of cells or new genetic makeup, that's that basic research that's still being done on animals to show that their brains recode.
That is correct.
And this research is being applied, if you will, to the behaviors of traumatized people and is explaining their behaviors based on this physiological phenomenon that has now been studied.
Yes.
Is there anything in the methodology, either of the studying of this genetic recoding, the basic research, or in the methodology of the applied research to explain the behaviors, that is anything new or different than standard medicine, standard biology, and standard psychology?
No.
Has this explanation for behavioral changes in trauma victims based on this genetic recoding of the limbic system gained acceptance in the community that treats, evaluates, diagnoses trauma victims?
Yes.
And has this research and these understandings been incorporated in the therapy and treatment of trauma victims?
Yes, it has been.
Has the understanding that there is a physiological cause for the flashbacks altered the way therapy is now being given to, say, post-traumatic stress disorder victims, Vietnam War veterans, traumatized children, that group of trauma victims?
Yes, it definitely has.
And is there extensive now publication and teaching in the new way to treat these people because of the understanding that there is a biological and physical cause to these flashbacks and not just a psychological one?
Yes.
Your Honor, I think that's an adequate foundation, but who am I? If the court feels,
That's what I say.
I know you do at every opportunity, but
Okay, yeah,
There you
always get
go.
the last word, but at this point, the prosecution has a right to cross-examine.
exactly.
Okay, then they will.
What is the limbic system?
The limbic system is a group of brain regions that primarily are composed of the hippocampus, the hypothalamus, and the meglioid section.
All right, just for a moment, let's move that chart over this way, and then we'll let the jurors come in so that they can be more comfortable in the jury room. All right? Go ahead.
I believe you indicated that in 1929, research began on, and was it on changes in the limbic system caused by fear or the limbic system itself?
No, it was Cannon's initial work on fight-flight phenomenon.
And was that a study that was done in relationship to the limbic system? Or was that a psychological study?
Oh, no, it was a physiological study that really began to explain behavior in the face of frightening situations.
And it was the beginning of research into the biological origins of fear and the response to fear?
Yes.
Okay. Now, I believe you've indicated that there's beginning to be research studies on a further refinement of the biology, which would be genetic recoding. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And when you say it's beginning, when did it begin and in what phase is this research?
Okay, the research really began about in the mid-'80s when the NIH began to fund research studies in this area. So it's roughly been a good 10 years where an enormous amount of money, federal money, has gone into various labs around the country to better understand the way the brain works and to begin to help explain behavior.
You talk about the way the brain works. The money that's been funded through the NIH on the way the brain works is not just confined to the phenomena of fear, but other things such as Alzheimer's disease,
Oh, yes.
the genetic origins of disease.
Right.
perhaps.
Actually, all the human genome study, which they're really trying to identify within cells, the genetic component so that it is a wider cut of types of studies, but they're all related to brain research. It comes under the rubric of the decade of the brain is what it's called, what the funding has been for.
And so the research is beginning, and I think you said the current research suggests, I think that was your word, suggests, that brain recoding, genetic recoding goes on as a result of continued application of fear. Would that be correct?
Yeah, as the fear is experienced, then there is an overstimulated, in other words, overwhelmed, so that there is going to be now some new recoding. That is when that seems to occur. That's what the research suggests.
Okay, but by suggests, is that the same as conclusively proven?
It's a research term. We always
Okay.
say suggest.
All right, and when you use suggest as a scientist, what are you trying to suggest?
Well, you suggest what the research is suggesting.
But it's not, is that, to me, suggestion means it's not, it's an idea, it's an inference, but it's not necessarily conclusive.
No, I wouldn't say that. I'd just say that tends to be the language that we use. I
Well-
could pick another word.
All right.
I prefer to use more research terms.
All right. In your mind, has it been conclusively proven that exposure to fear creates genetic recoding?
I'm gonna object to that. That's not appropriate on the relevancy issue
Right.
or foundation issue. That's a weight attack.
No, it has to do with the reliability and scientific evidence, which is what the court is concerned with here. Objection overruled.
Do you remember my question?
Yes, I believe, my opinion is that the research is quite substantial in this area that states that genetic recoding does occur in terms of the fear response when the person has been overwhelmed with fear.
And what is the effect of the genetic recoding when a person is then exposed to fear another time?
You know, what happens is the recoding has to do with survival because fear is tied into survival, that the basic instinct in a person is to survive. So that when it gets recoded, it now gets recoded in terms of a higher level. And one of the terms that is used is what's called rekindling. So that when somebody is, this person who is now exposed to another fearful situation will not take as much as someone who has not been to elicit this fear. So that's why we talk about the fear level increases. The cueing in can be much more subtle than in someone who has not been exposed to such fearful situations.
Now, psychology has suspected this for a long time, correct? That repeated exposure to fear lessens the time in which a person reacts to it.
It's been in their literature, yes.
Okay, and it's now, since the mid-'80s and the decade of the brain, that people are beginning to look at the biological origins of a psychological response.
That's
Would that be
correct.
fair to say?
Yeah.
Okay. Is there any way to test a particular human being who's still alive to see if the genetic recoding has occurred?
Well, you see it in their behavior. You mean, well, they're doing the PETs, well,
In other words, not
yeah.
a test like an X-ray. I mean,
Well, they do the scannings. They use the PET scannings. And this is the imaging that as the technology has so improved in terms of being able to study the brain, that's really what's being used for humans as opposed to studying, of course, in animals.
Is dissecting the brain a better way to determine if there's been genetic recoding?
Your Honor, I'm going to object to that. That is not a foundational question. That is an argumentative question.
Well, in a general sense, has it ever been verified by looking at a brain of a deceased and analyzing it with us in mind?
Well, they do look at brains of deceased people. For example, Alzheimer's is just one good example. Schizophrenics are another good example where they really do go in after someone has died to try to see where in the brain, if there are any, whatever they can see.
Observable defects that might explain the Alzheimer's.
Yeah, but the problem is when you have a person that's deceased, you don't have that response. You don't have the potential for the response because
You can't stimulate the brain anymore.
you can't stimulate the brain.
I think what my question then is there a test that you could do on a human being to see if they've had genetic recoding, which would indicate to you that they have been subjected to multiple incidents of fear?
Well, one of the problems is you don't have the before, you don't have the after.
All right, so
You have the new coding, if you will.
Can you say that a specific person that you're interviewing has genetic recoding?
You can certainly tell their level of fear and the way, and this is where this has been so useful in the applied section to persons who have been traumatized, because once you get a clear understanding of what it is that originally has traumatized them, then you can begin to make the association, the link, if you will, to what in the current situation is triggering that fear reaction. Because they give an actual explanation, the whole body reacts, the heart increases, the blood, everything kind of activates for preparing the person to fight or flee.
But in terms of that's, there are all kinds of physiological responses to fear, correct?
Yes.
You've just described many of them.
Yes.
And in addition, there is the genetic recoding that occurs as the stimulus increases or persists over time. Correct. And do you have any way of knowing how much stimulus is necessary to trigger genetic recoding?
No, I don't. I don't personally know that right now without researching it.
All right. Is there any way that you can talk about the neurobiology of fear,
Yes.
but is there any way to apply it to a specific individual and say that this specific individual suffers from genetic recoding or has experienced genetic recoding, and that means they've been exposed to fear?
Well, we don't say it that way.
Well, is there a way to say it that's comparable to what I'm trying to say?
Yeah. What we would say is they get an alteration in their fear processing. See, this now ties in with the way information comes into the brain and gets processed. So it has to link in, because humans have a factor that animals don't. They have cognition. They have a brain that can, think and talk, etc. So that is what ties in. So yes, to your question, that you can see an altered response to fear processing. They do not process fear as people who have not been exposed to that trauma do.
But the way you determine that is by just observing the human being's response to fear.
Well, one of the things that's occurring in the research is to try to get some of the chemicals. These stress hormones are released in the brain, and it interferes with the way the information goes back and forth, so that they are beginning to look at what, blood tests is going to be one possibility to see that people have this higher level of stress hormones, brain hormones.
Has that methodology been perfected? In other words,
well, yes. I mean, the pharmacology of trying to treat was one of the very promising areas to now give the medications that can reduce the fear processing. So yes, there are, and these are drug trials that go on, and they're specifically looking at, for example, PTSD in a way of reducing that intrusive imagery.
And the way they're doing it is by giving certain kinds of
Unless
medicine.
this is something that's going to be introduced here, let's get on to something else.
Okay, all right. So I'm going to ask the question again, and maybe, is there any way you can test an individual, for instance, Eric Menendez, and say with certainty that that he has had genetic recoding as a result of being exposed to fear?
There is not a blood test currently available. That's the only way you would be able to neurobiologically look at it.
All right.
And you have to do it at the time that they're being under stress, so that seeing someone at a current state when you're trying to look back is not necessarily, you're not necessarily going to get those stress hormones.
There are other physiological responses that you can look at to determine if someone is undergoing stress, such as the things that you look for in a lie detector test, right? Things, increased heart rate, perspiration.
I don't know about
that. Who knows what
Lie detector tests are all about. I don't think it's
All right, get on to something else.
Okay. But there is presently no way to establish that a particular individual has had this genetic decoding as long as they're still alive, correct?
Well, no, you can observe their behavior. I mean, that's what we have currently, and what this does is not to explain the behavioral symptoms, so that it really adds to what we already have.
But you're looking at behavior, and you're not running a chemical test.
But that's what fear response is behavior.
All right. I have nothing further.
All right, anything else?
Yeah, just to clarify one thing, you've always known, I mean, I won't say always, but for a long, long time, how the body reacts to fear with respect to releasing hormones, releasing chemicals, that's all been known. That's been mapped. That's been measured, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
The more recent additional piece of knowledge to how the body reacts to fear is that the brain itself undergoes genetic changes.
That's correct.
And that's been proven in the animal studies where they have then dissected the little critters and looked at their brain and seen that they've been remapped.
Yes.
Correct? So that's just a further explanation, the biological root, therefore, of what's triggering all those hormones, all that chemical reaction, all that behavior.
That's correct.
So that's how it's understood now.
Yes.
The behavior's still there and it's observable.
Yes.
All right, let me ask the defense, what exactly is it that you intend to elicit from this witness in her testimony?
Pretty much what she's just been testifying to, that they understand that this is the source of the fear response in humans, that it sends out these chemicals that cause behaviors when under stress, that in people who have experienced traumatic stress in the past, the brain may react to an even lower level of stimulation than in people who have not previously experienced fear, traumatic fear. That when the brain does react, it stimulates this chemical reaction that causes behaviors that is not hooked into the cognitive section of the brain, but is hooked into the limbic system, which is an intuitive, autonomic type of system.
And is she going to testify as an expert in regards to either defendant, that she has examined them or formed any opinions that, in fact, that they have suffered this physiological change?
No. She's going to say that, in her opinion, Eric Menendez has suffered traumatic fear in the past, particularly concerning his sexual molestation by his father, and and he has a history of intrusive thoughts about that. But more important, he also has a history of high anxiety and hyper monitoring behavior, in that
This is all based on information that has been provided to the witness from other sources, such as anecdotes of one sort or another.
All kinds of behavioral information, not just from Eric, but from testing, from school records, all the stuff that we've heard about.
Basically, she assumes that all that has occurred, and if it did occur, it would create a certain response in an individual. Is that basically what you're saying?
Well, what she's going to say is based on his behavioral response. He's not going to say that she cannot say his brain is altered and therefore that's this response. She's going to say his behavioral responses are such that the understanding now is there may actually be a change in the brain that causes these behavioral responses. That's what the research shows, that there's actually a biological trigger. Now, there's always been a biological trigger for fear. What she's going to testify to is, with traumatized people, that biological trigger may operate on a lower level. So where before, Your Honor, for example, the kind of
But
information...
she's not saying that is what occurred, or if it did occur at all, in Eric Menendez.
Well,
she's describing in general that is what happens.
Well, that's all she's doing before both juries. We can duke out how far she can go down the path about Eric Menendez in front of his jury alone, but she isn't going to do that in front of both.
Okay, so what is the people's position in regards to this?
The neurobiology of fear is not relevant to this particular case, because there's no way of showing that there's no way currently of showing that these defendants have in fact had this genetic recoding, which would account for them having this biological response. And as to the genetic recoding, now as to the biological response of the flight or the fight and the increased heart rate and the release of certain kinds of adrenaline, for instance, that might be pertinent, because those are things that can be tested for. But in terms of what you can't test for this, obviously, the test is not available. There's no blood test for it. And all she can do is say, in general, this is what the research tends to show may be occurring. And there may be a change in the brain, but we don't know if there's a change in their brain. So how is it relevant?
Let me just say, this is no different than what Eris was talking about.
The psychological evidence of battered and abused people indicates that they pick up on very subtle cues. They see fear where other people might not see it, and they react to it on a heightened level because of their experience. This is no different, except it explains the biological basis for it. That's all.
Are you saying this happens in all individuals, this biological change in the brain, or just in some?
No, this does happen when the individual's overwhelmed with fear.
In everybody?
Yes.
And this recoding, genetic recoding that you've described, that happens in everybody?
If it's sufficient. Now that piece isn't quite clear, but certainly people get the fight-flight phenomenon
All right.
Fight flight is a
Fight, flight.
phenomenon that applies to every human being
That's
and
correct.
every animal on the face
That's
of the
correct.
earth. Whether there's been a recoding so that
Okay,
someone,
let's not-
yeah, okay? I just want to make it clear for you, Your Honor.
Yeah, I understand the part of it. Okay, in light of the evidence introduced here, the court finds that the defense has met its minimal burden for a foundation for this evidence to be produced. It doesn't mean that the witness may testify in regards to what actually happened in the situation of each defendant, but she can describe in general the nature of this reaction. Right. Anything else now before we proceed? All right, let's get the juries in. As I indicated, one juror needs to take a break at 3:15 to go to a medical appointment, so that's what will happen. And we're ready to proceed.
Okay. Dr. Burgess, before we get into an actual explanation and going through the diagrams of the brain and the schematic of the brain that's up there, with respect to the limbic system, has the limbic system of the brain been studied for some time as the location of the human body's response to fear-inducing stimulus?
Yes, it has.
And is that the place where a fear stimulus comes in and where a set of reactions begin?
That is correct, yes.
Okay. And what has been known in the recent, how far back does this particular research on the limbic system as the fear response locus?
The writing goes back to 1929, Walter Buchanan,
Okay.
who,
And what was the basic understanding from all the, there's been research in this over the years as well.
yes, there has been.
It's almost 60 years of research.
Yes.
More than 60 years. And what is the basic understanding, biological working of this part of the brain as the locus for the body's fear response? How does it work?
How does it work? First of all,
Before we do the
Oh,
diagram,
okay.
if you could just give us a general idea of how it works.
okay. In the brain, there are what are called billions of neurons. And the task of these neurons is to transmit information.
Mhm.
The brain also is mapped. It's what's called neural mapping, and so that they can trace how the parts of the brain interact with each other. And these neurons take the information back and forth. In the limbic system is also housed where information comes in. So it's a very, very important part of the brain where information comes in, as well as the center for alarm and protection.
Now, it's that center. Let's say a piece of fear-inducing information comes in, okay?
Yes.
I step off the curb and a truck is coming towards me,
Yes,
right? Now, that information gets processed into this system.
yes,
And this is also the system where my body's going to respond to that truck.
yes.
Okay, what does my body do in response to that truck?
Okay, there are 3 phases. The first is what's called, as the person reacts, it's the preparatory phase. And this is where the body is alerted that there is some danger. Maybe you hear that truck coming down the street. And so what starts to activate are the brain hormones, the stress hormones, that are now going to prepare the individual for the second phase, which is where the body now must make a decision as to whether it is going to fight or flee. In other words, are you going to jump back out of the street as that truck comes, or are you going to run across the street to try to get out of its way?
Okay, now before you get to fight or flight, I think I'll give you a different example than a truck for that. But first of all, what are the hormones that the brain releases?
Okay.
This-
There are actually 2, and it's what's called a kind of biphasic. In other words, 2 phases. It's the noradrenergic system gets activated.
Okay. Called
And
the N system.
yeah, and it has what's called, it inhibits and it activates. So this is the 2 phases that is now, which speaks to the fight flight phenomenon. So that you have both of these stress hormones going, and it shows itself also in one's body because it is preparing the body to fight so that the muscles get taut, the heart beats.
Is this what releases adrenaline?
Absolutely, yes.
Okay, well,
That's
that's
one
sort
of
of-
the stress hormones.
Okay,
Yes.
so one of the stress hormones releases adrenaline or activates the adrenal system to release adrenaline?
Right, and it gets activated in the brain, even though people feel it in the rest of their body. The brain is the primary place where it gets activated. And then because these neurons are telling the rest of the body what to do, how to prepare itself to do something.
Okay. And people usually report that there are certain physiological symptoms of terror, if
Yes,
you will.
they do.
Rapid heartbeat, for
Yes.
example. That's because of adrenaline. That's one of the things that the stress hormones release.
Yes, it's getting more blood, if you will, to the body so that it will be prepared.
Okay. Adrenaline stimulates the heart to beat.
Yes,
The beating creates more blood.
that's right.
Okay. People also talk about a tingling sensation, breathing sensations. Are these things sometimes sweat breaking out on the brow,
Yes.
clamminess, and that? Are these physiological reactions all caused by the release of these stress hormones from this center of the brain?
Yes, and it's all automatic. It's not under anybody's control. This just happens automatically.
Now, you said the first phase is the alarm bells are going off
Yes,
and all this stuff is flowing.
yes,
Okay. The second phase now is when the body needs to take action of some kind.
that's correct.
In talking about, and this has been called the fight-flight stage, correct?
That's correct.
And let's talk about it in terms of fight-flight. Let's say somebody is coming at me to attack me, fists are up and
Yes,
looks really angry. Now I've got to decide, my body's got to decide whether to fight him or to run.
that's right.
Okay. Now, what is going on then biologically in this second stage when I'm being faced by this attack?
Well, that's essentially when all of the hormones are spreading to tell the body to pick two of these decisions of what you're going to do, make a decision.
Okay. All right. And how is this decision making made? Now, I mean, is this if the body's with all these alarm bells going on, okay,
Mhm.
is the decision to fight or flight a decision that's made in the cognitive part, or is this a decision that's being made from this automatic, everything's flowing part?
Well, see, it generally is automatic because people, again, to use the other analogy, are going to jump back if they see a truck coming.
They're
And
not going to think.
They're
I
not
should
even going to think, right? They're just going to, because it's instinctual. The fear response is present in the body to protect the person from danger. So survival becomes the main goal, if you will, why this whole system gets activated.
And these reactions, this fight-flight reaction, is instantaneous and automatic?
Yes.
Okay, and now in this particular phase, when the body is sprung into action, either jumping back or running forward, is there another set of hormones that get released, triggered from the limbic system?
Yes. And then there's the third phase.
Okay.
And this is what's called the blunting phase. And now the hormones change to kind of blunt pains. Take, for example, a physical trauma. In other words, people can not even realize that they've had an injury, and they see the next day that their arm is black and blue. And they might even say, how did I get that? Then they will have to think back to how they got it, because the blunting, if you will, the opioid system is activated to protect the person from the pain.
Now, the body releases opiate-type hormones that act upon neurons in such a way, nerve endings, that you don't feel pain.
That's right.
Now, is that the same thing that happens, say, if you're confronted and you're stabbed and you don't feel the wound
That's right.
for a
Yeah.
while?
Yes. In fact, trauma victims coming into an emergency room very often will describe that quite vividly.
Okay, so we've been through these three stages. The first hormones are the alert system. Then there's the second phase where the body automatically reacts. And
Yes.
then there's the third blunting phase.
That's right.
Now, in this blunting phase, when the opiate system is activated, are there physical symptoms of this as well?
Yes.
And what are the physical symptoms of this?
What happens here is if the danger finally passes, then the body now is in almost an exhausted phase. And if there has been too much stimulation and activation of all of this, I mean, you can ultimately get death from such extended trauma. But essentially, in situations we've just been talking about, the person would feel kind of exhausted. There's a crisis and all the body reacts, and then they would just feel a lot of exhaustion. And that's the way the body is going to rejuvenate itself, get itself back, if you will, reset itself. The brain's got to reset itself.
Okay. Now, with respect to those things that set off the alarms to begin with, the fear response, okay, is there a terminology for what those things are that set off a fear response?
Extreme danger.
Okay. Are there cues that set off a fear response?
Yeah, anything in the environment that the person feels as a threat is going to set that off.
Now, your research was not this fundamental research into how the limbic system works, because that's been a given in medical biological circles for a long time, correct?
That's correct.
Your research and other more recent research has to do with what? With tying this to what?
Well, applying this to the symptoms that we see in traumatized populations so that we can better assist and help someone who has had a traumatizing experience.
Okay. Now, has it been understood and known in psychological research for some time that people who have been traumatized, who have experienced overwhelming fear over the course of their life, tend to react differently to new threats of fear than people who have not been traumatized by fear?
Yes.
And what is the difference that has been studied from watching and knowing about the behaviors of people?
Okay. What happens when there's been overwhelming fear and it's been repeated very often is that in the brain, there is what's called a genetic recoding. And so the fear level now for that person is going to be at a different level than for someone who has not experienced whatever that fear was.
Before we get to that, let's just talk about a behavioral stand before we get to what the brain is doing, okay? The recent research shows that there's actually been genetic changes in the brains of overwhelmingly traumatized people.
Yes.
So their brain system will operate automatically in response to new fear cues at a much quicker level than people who have never been subjected to overwhelming fear.
Yes.
Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
But before we get to this new research on genetic recoding, was there observable in the behavior of people who had been traumatized, overwhelmed by fear, that they were having fear reactions?
Oh, yes.
Okay. They were having fear reaction based on much lower levels of stimulus than my truck coming down the street.
Yes.
Okay. So a horn could honk and they'd freak out, basically.
That's right. Yes.
Okay. And you have said that you were led into this research because of intrusive thoughts, of flashbacks, of re-experiencing fearful events among trauma victims.
That's correct.
But was there also observed, apart from people having flashbacks or re-experiencing, was there also observed among traumatized people heightened sensitivity to cues of potential fear?
Yes. Yes.
Was there also observed anxiety levels in these people, a sort of high ongoing level of fear?
Yes.
You're familiar with the research on abused children that talks about such things as hypervigilance.
Yes, I am.
What does hypervigilance have to do with this discussion about fear and reaction to fear?
In essence, that observation is explained by this fear-altered process. In other words, something in the environment is causing that the person is constantly searching the environment for anything that may be dangerous.
And that seems to be a common characteristic of people who have been traumatized by fear-inducing behaviors.
Yes, it is.
All right, with abused children, for example, or battered wives, for example, people who have been physically or psychologically or sexually assaulted.
Yes.
Do they develop patterns of hypervigilance, minute watching of the behaviors of the people who have assaulted them or battered them?
Yes, they do.
And do they appear as a group to have this generalized high level of anxiety?
Yes, they do.
And has there been a great deal of research on how easily thrown into high levels of fear they are by the slightest changes or cues in the behavior of their batterers.
Yes, in that type of situation, yes.
Now, the latest research that you were talking about, this genetic recoding, okay? How does this research connect to this behavioral, psychological body of research that's existed for some time?
Okay. Well, the genetic recoding now explains why the person is at a higher level of fear and must survey their environment in this heightened way.
Is there a notion that's come from this, strike that, is it now believed that people who experience these fear-inducing traumas, that their brain actually repatterns?
Yes, it gets rewired, repatterned. That's, yes.
And is there a term, rekindling, that is associated with this research?
Yes, there is.
Would you explain to us what the rekindling term
Okay.
means?
Rekindling essentially means that as the new people have not been traumatized are at one level. People who have been traumatized, it takes much less to activate their fear response. And literally, it's a term. Rekindling means that there already is a base there for the fear to be activated, and so it just takes much less or more subtle kinds of cues in the environment to activate their fear response.
I think it's 3:15, Your Honor.
All right, we do have a situation where one of the jurors has an emergency medical appointment to attend to, so we'll accommodate that and recess for the day and for the week. And before I let you go, ladies and gentlemen, let me remind you of what I have said before, that you must not form any final opinions about this case until you've heard all of the evidence. You must not discuss this case among yourselves or with anyone else. And don't permit yourselves to be exposed to anything about this case in any form whatsoever outside of the courtroom. You must make your decision based only on the evidence you hear in this courtroom and my instructions on the law. We'll be in recess until Monday at 9 o'clock. We'll see you all back here at that time, Monday at 9 o'clock. Witnesses ordered to return at that time.